So we had a few questions about how we as journalists, and especially those of us who are not Native American, can respectfully cover issues that affect Native communities. So, for example, what are some stereotypes that media have perpetuated in the past that we should avoid? Just kind of some guidelines for how we can best cover these communities.
That's a great question. I think that journalists are getting better and better at this sort of thing, because I think they're just getting better and better at covering all communities. And so the same way that you would kind of cover any other, sort of BIPOC community, that's the way you should, think about tribal communities. I think some of the things that, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, the newer, journalists, they understand things a lot better. They're trained a lot better. I don't think I've ever had a weird question from a younger journalist. And by that, I mean anybody like under the age of 30. It's usually sort of the older folks who've been around for a while that you're just like, what? What did you just ask me? And younger folks, that's not a problem. And again, because it has to do with training. And people who are younger think about these things and spend more time trying to address or think about, the way that they're writing about or speaking about tribal communities. I think the only thing I would say that is always sort of been a constant kind of misnomer is trying to understand, because people don't learn this in school, tribal governments, there are 3 governments in the United States. There's the federal government, there's tribal governments, and there's state governments. And in the hierarchy of governments, federal government and tribal government are like this. They're equals. State governments are way down here. State governments do not have the same sovereignty or authority that tribes do. Oftentimes when journalists write about tribal governments, they think of them as federal, state, tribe, kind of down here. And they often I often hear people say that a tribe is like a municipality, and a municipality is like, the city of Champaign. Mm-hmm. Not at all. States do not even come close to having the same authority that tribes do, or the same level of sovereignty that tribes do. And so that's something that even with younger journalists, I always have to correct their wording sometimes, and I will correct people after the fact. If I read a story and say, wait, what are you talking about? Because sometimes it's just 1 or 2 words that need to be changed in the way that they're describing tribal governments. And again, that sort of hierarchy. So for example, this doesn't happen so much with younger people, it happens with older folks. Saying things like, the federal government gave tribes land. The federal government has never given tribes land. Tribes retain their land from time immemorial because tribes were here first. So the federal government has taken land away, but they've never given land to. And so that's one of those weird, those things to always keep track of when you're writing about tribes, that tribes continue to live in usually the same places they've always lived. They retain, and similar to kind of the land thing is centered around rights. Sometimes I'll read that the federal that the federal government gave, tribes the right to do X, Y, Z, and usually.
Hi, my name's Fizza, and I wanted to ask you, what sort of questions are you personally tired of hearing from journalists? What should people stop asking about?
Oh, that's a good question. I get interviewed a lot by journalists. Okay, so this week, I'm not tired of this question because so this week, you guys know there was a big, huge protest, right, on Sunday. the March to End Fossil Fuels. 75,000 people went to New York City. So this week, several people are doing articles on climate change. And then also, as you know, right now at the United Nations, folks are there for General Council. And so there's lots of conversation around climate change as well. So there have been several articles, and there'll be more about climate change in the coming week. So yeah, in fact, I'll be interviewed tomorrow morning again on a climate change report. So let's see, where was I heading with this conversation? So there's always stories, as you guys know, as emerging journalists, there's always going to be stories that happen because of something else in the news. So like the reason why people are doing climate change stories right now is because of those two things that are in the news, the United Nations and then the march. So people just kind of say, okay, now we're going to do a story. We want to do a story about XYZ, you know. And because some places are trying to include multiple voices, they almost always want to then sort of say, well, what do Native people think? And they'll try to find a Native person or a quote from a Native person. Sometimes that can be a little too, I don't know what the word is. I mean, sometimes that can seem a little too much like trying to check a box, right? And not really asking for people's real thinking about something, but just sort of checking the box of making sure you include that voice, and versus sort of a, I don't know, kind of a doing something that's a more a story that's important. I work with lots of journalists in the state of Montana and get them to do stories. So I've been doing that for a long time. I'll just FYI, one of my best friends is a journalist in Chicago, and so I always try. So because of her, I feel like I know a little bit more about what journalists do. But because of her, I instead of saying, oh gosh, someone should do a story on XYZ, I actually pitch it to people now. Not that I'm going to write the story, but they should write the story. So I constantly contact, like I said, there's a couple of journalists in Montana that I constantly contact. There's a journalist at High Country News that I contact on a regular basis. There's folks that I contact and say, do this story, do that story. And I try to tell them why it's important. Sometimes things in Native communities are so nuanced, again, because tribes are first original to this place, to have governments that have a lot of power. And so sometimes it gets too much kind of nuance for a general audience to understand. In the United States, not in other places. Canada, your average Canadian citizen understands tribal sovereignty, understands tribal power, understands the history of settler colonialism way, way better than folks in the United States. Like, we are so far behind in the United States. It's not even funny. In fact, I had a journalist who went to a conference in Canada and they were like, oh my God, I was totally blown away, blah, blah, blah. And then they called me and said, okay, I need to talk to you about, you know, XYZ situation happening. Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm not sure if there's probably not too many questions anymore that bother me that journalists ask. Again, because people are better trained now than they used to be. I get tired of questions that general audience people ask me all the time about Native people. I think for a long time, there was well, maybe it's still out there, who knows? There was a stereotype about reservations and reservation communities as being kind of like the quote unquote ghetto, which they're not at all. And there was a time when people thought that everybody should leave the reservation and not live there, like people needed to be rescued somehow from reservations. And so I would often get those kind of weird comments of like, you know, oh, you don't live on the reservation anymore. Oh, aren't you, you know, like, aren't you relieved? Aren't you so glad that you're not there anymore? And I'm just like, are you kidding? I would love to live on the reservation if the University of Illinois was there, you know, like, that's where my job is. You know, that's home. So anyway, I think there used to be a time where, oh my God, like people always ask those kinds of questions about being on a reservation as being like this terrible thing and this terrible experience. And, you know, I should be so happy that I don't live there anymore. I still get that every once in a while, again, from older folks, but not too much anymore. So that was a long answer, convoluted answer to that question. But no, I think the thing is that there's always, again, and you guys will know this one, for those of you who are studying journalism and who become professional journalists, the stories change like every single week, and like whatever's happening is like, that's what's happening and that's what you're going to do a story on. And I know, for example, in the state of Montana, there's a newspaper there that for a while they worked really hard that they were not going to have, that whenever they had a story about anything, I mean, I'm trying to think of something, you know, about banking, about, you know, I don't know, back to school, you know, clothes shopping, that they would try to include Native people in regular stories and not just have Native people when there was something like, I don't know, a drive-by shooting or, you know, something like something negative. Because oftentimes in some places, the stories about Native people are always negative, or minority people in general are always negative. And so there was one newspaper that tried really hard that whenever they had a quote unquote, just a people story, that they included Native people in those stories of just regular people doing regular stuff. And so that's something to think about, especially when there's the week-to-week stories that people do, is how do you include multiple kind of voices in some of that stuff? Yeah.
My name is Stephanie. I'm slightly off camera, but I'm here. So on the other hand, are there any questions that you would like to hear more of from journalists?
Well, like I said, I mean, I try to call people and tell them do a story on thus and such. So for example, today this is in Western Montana, the Missoulian newspaper is like the big paper in Western Montana. I have a former student, I'm still an advisor of hers, who's graduating this December with their master's degree. She got a huge grant from MIT and to do a big project on grizzly bears. And so I just called the local newspaper and said, hey, do a story on Stephanie. Like, she just got this grant. She's like amazing. She's doing this big thing on grizzly bears. And so then and I shared all the information. And so the reporter's like, oh, sure. So it came out today. She's on the front page of the Western all of Western Montana newspaper. And then it's going to be shared because it's part of Lee newspapers. It'll be shared with all of the Lee newspapers as well. So I try to call folks as much as possible and pitch stories to them, usually good stories, every once in a while not. And sometimes people say, yes, that sounds interesting, I'll do it. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes stories, like I said, get to be a little too nuanced for general audience, and newspapers won't do it because it's like we'll have to explain way too much before we get to the gist of the story. I think that sometimes now there are some things that yeah, I was gonna say yeah, I usually try to I'm trying to think of some stories that I've pitched a bunch of stories recently. Got shot down on several where people was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Okay. But usually it's like good. I try to do sort of more good people news when I can. But I personally write a lot of stuff. So I don't know if you guys saw the piece that I did on the fires at Maui. I wrote that about a month ago. It was in the Conversation. So after the fires that happened at Maui, at Lahaina, there was all of these stories that were done about the burn. Well, obviously, I'm sure you guys saw all of these stories and you probably saw all of the photographs, but basically the entire town burnt down, right? Thousands of houses, hundreds of businesses, and it was pretty devastating. But in kind of the national media, one of the things that started people doing stories on was the settler colonial history, the church that burnt down, the original settlers' home that burnt down, the banyan tree, right, that burnt down. I mean, the banyan tree was planted 50 years after the introduction of Christianity as a commemoration of Christianity coming to Maui, right? It was planted by a priest. And banyan trees, FYI, are not even native to Hawaii. They're introduced. The folks in Hawaii hate them because they're such an invasive plant species now. Anyway, so there was sort of like this settler colonial history that was being shared. I mean, it was in the New York Times, it was in the Washington Post. So I contacted the folks that I write for at the Conversation, and I said, hey, can I do a story about not settler colonial history, but that the folks who live in the native Hawaiian folks here, they actually lost some sacred landscape and some sacred places to them. Who freaking cares about the church that burnt down? Because they're just going to build it all over again. When sacred sites burn down, that's a totally different story. So anyway, so I wrote that a month ago. The PBS NewsHour picked it up. And so it's been widely read. And because of that story, there have now been several other stories that talk about native landscapes, native sacred sites that are not the settler colonial story. So I tried as best I could to kind of disrupt that narrative that was going out there. In those cases, I try to write the story because I don't often think that a reporter is going to get the nuance of that, of how there's a different story here. And let's stop talking about that stupid banyan tree. I know all the native Hawaiians there are like, thank God it burnt down, because they see it as an image of Christianity, right? And settler colonial history and an invasive plant species. That's what they see it as. But that's not what's getting reported by the New York Times. The New York Times did this big, huge, people crying about the banyan tree, and didn't get the other side of the story of people celebrating that the damn banyan tree burnt down. Anyway, so sometimes I try to do that sort of thing where I sometimes pitch it to somebody, but other times I try to do it myself. I'll give another example of that. A year ago, when the Dobbs decision happened, I wanted to write. So a couple of people wrote about this in small ways. So there were a couple of articles about how abortion is different for folks in the Jewish tradition. They view abortion differently. There were a couple of folks who wrote about how different cultures think about abortion differently. And that what the Dobbs decision did was pushed forward a Christian view of life and a Christian view of the immorality of abortion. So I wanted to write, and again, I knew that if I called somebody and said, hey, write about this, they wouldn't write about it in the same way. To write about how Native people thought about abortion differently, how Native people had been conducting abortions for thousands of years, by using ethnobotanical methods, and how Indigenous people think about life, right, differently than Christians do. And so myself and my daughter, who's a freelance writer, the first place we contacted was Yes Magazine, because we wanted somebody to take the story quickly and do a quick turnaround. And so we contacted Yes and said, would you be interested in us writing this story? And they said, yeah. And they contacted us literally, within about 4 hours and said, yes, please write that story. So we got it out in less than a week, which is a fast time for people who are not journalists, to sit down and write something really quickly. That got picked up by lots of different folks. After Yes published it, it got translated in a lot of different languages. It's probably it's not the most read article that I've written, but it's one of the most read articles that I've written. And then after that happened, it got reprinted in a book, as a chapter in a book. Myself and my daughter were interviewed multiple times by other media about presenting a different viewpoint about abortion and how the Dobbs decision was going to impact Indigenous people. My concern about Dobbs, and still is that Indigenous people have always had abortion, and again used ethnobotanical methods of not only abortion but also birth control and other types of reproductive health. And if you read the Dobbs decision, it is so vague about the way that it describes quote unquote like medicine and medicinal, that you can't tell who it will impact. So my concern is somebody who, like my grandmother, would my grandmother be arrested for doing the same types of doctoring that she's done all of her life? Would somebody's curandera be arrested because they're doing the same types of medicinal activities that they've always done for years? Because there's not really a clear distinction between like a medical, like abortion, and what people who do practice ethnobotany do. So anyway, in those cases, I try to write the stuff myself if I can, versus having somebody else do it. But oftentimes I try my best to contact journalists and say, hey, do a story about this, and then try to get something put out there.